Hi, I'd like to give a few tips about doing an IKEA kitchen that I've learned along the way. And when I was looking on YouTube and asking questions, these are things I didn't think of, and I think it would be really good to share them with some people. One of the things you're going to do before you go to the design studio is take your measurements from corner to corner on all the walls where there's going to be cupboards. Now, I wish I had taken this dimension across the front to the other wall and in the back, and up where the upper rail was, front and back. That's because we don't know that these walls are true. We don't know how much extra mud was put there when they did these walls. The next dimension we're going to want to be sure of is where the hole is for the exhaust fan for outside, if you have one. I have an under-counter mount here, which means my exhaust vent can be anywhere in this cupboard. If you're planning on using one with a chimney, you're going to want to make sure that your cupboards are situated so that the chimney covers the exhaust hole. Hope that's clear. The next thing to think about, in my opinion, is where are your drains and your supply lines from your plumbing? I didn't think of that, and it became obvious when I was assembling the cupboards that I had a problem. My vent pipe for my drain came down this wall and out at about the height of the cupboard, and it wasn't a problem with my previous cupboards because the drawers didn't go all the way back. On the IKEA ones, they go too far back. So I ended up having to cut the pipe, put it in the wall, and then drop it down underneath the space where the cupboard was. So then I ended up having to cut the floor, not the joists or anything, but just the floor, and run the pipe over and pop up under the sink. The same thing with the supply lines. I had to change those and move them over into the sink in order to have a nice, neat job. I capped them all, and with the drain, I tested it before I put the cupboards in with a garden hose. So take your time, but realize where your plumbing is might be an issue with your new cupboard. You have all your IKEA materials and you're good to go. So what you're doing is determining the height to set your rail at, and it gives you a height in the instructions. What you want to do is get yourself a laser level, one that shoots all the way around your room, and you're looking for the highest point in the floor of your kitchen. So you're going to measure inside and outside, and at my house, it was outside where the feet are, was the highest point, and it was in the opposite side of the room. So whatever the dimension they give you for your rail, take it from the highest point in your room. And the reason is, if you use the highest point in your room, you're not going to have to cut all your baseboards, because you're not going to get over here and say, oh, I don't have enough space. So remember, find the highest point in your room, and when you're measuring the height to set your rail at, take the measurement from there, mark it on the wall, take your laser level, put it at that level, and then you'll be able to draw the line all the way around your room where you're going to put your rail. Cupboards require somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 inch between a bulkhead and the cupboard to install, because you have your rail across there and you need to be able to lift the cupboard up and tip it in, and then it drops down onto the rail. So for installation purposes, you need about 1 inch space up here. So if you don't like the look of that, you need to think about how you're going to hide it. So you go down to the IKEA store, and you know where your range hood vent is, and you know where your plumbing is, and you know where your smallest dimensions on every wall are, so you're in good shape. And they have stock cupboards, and they will fit them into a diagram and help you design your kitchen. What you have to be aware of is, I was only quoted on the doors and the cupboards right here, and the cupboards are a different color than the door. So if I didn't want to look at the matte melamine sides, you basically have to trim all these cupboards out, and that's here, the crown on the top, in the corners here, like it's a lot, there's a lot of trimming. So they don't really know how many of those you need and how many you're going to use. So that's all going to be extras. And those things are about $40 each. And there's quite a few of them in this kitchen. Another thing to know is that if you don't trim out with these filler strips the side of this cabinet, you're going to see a gap here that could be as much as a ½ an inch. Because remember, they hang from the rail up here, and they sell you those little plastic feet that are part of the kit, that are supposed to be on the back of these cupboards. So they're designed to be out from the wall, so that you need these filler strips in order to hide that space. Or you'd have to use quarter round, you'd have to do something. So be prepared that you need to buy these or do something else to cover the space that will be right here. These Ikea trim pieces are designed for under-counter lighting. You can see, and I haven't cut this one, it goes all the way down, and it goes down far enough that it accepts this trim piece that can be cut for the under-counter lighting. If you don't add these trim pieces, you'll end up having to cut every single one of these. This wasn't very hard to do. It comes with little brackets. It comes with short screws that you need if you use them on the bottom. And you don't have to put the lights underneath. Ikea sells their own under-counter lighting, and they allow you to drop the wire in behind in that ½ inch gap that will be left there. I had my buddy who's an electrician, thanks Ivan, come over and measure for these lights, and he ran the wires in behind and they came out perfect. So that's another tip. If you have friends, use them. I had Ivan, I had my contractor friend Johnny help me decide how to fix the plumbing. If you have resources, make sure you use them. It'll make your life so much easier, and thanks to those guys. So I had my plan, and I found that the Ikea people do make mistakes. This cupboard is a corner unit that goes through here, and there's supposed to be a lazy Susan inside here. And the door is supposed to open the other way. Well, this is a 21-inch door, and the guy put 18-inch drawers here with a little space for a filler strip so I could get my stove in. And if I left the 21-inch door here, it would have smacked my stove. And he knew where the stove was. So what I ended up having to do was put a shelf in so that I could hang the door the other way. So, they're not immune to designing in interference problems. So don't be too upset if you come into something like that. Another issue I had was these upper cupboards are all melamine on the bottom. They have a thick bottom and a top, and the bottoms are different. These lowers are different. They have melamine bottom here, but up here is just a steel rail, and I guess the support comes from the countertop being glued down to it. So what would basically happen in this cupboard is I open the door, I pull out the Lazy Susan, and the Lazy Susan would rub against the side here. And I couldn't figure out for the life of me what the problem was. And I have a space that was built in here. They don't have a cupboard this small. I had a space that was built in here by my dishwasher, and it gave me clearance to my stove. And what I ended up having to do was take a small 12-inch cupboard, I cut it down, I hung one side of it from the rail here, and I screwed it to this cupboard that's back here. And believe it or not, that stiffened the side up enough that my Lazy Susan is fine. So it dawned on me, and I know it now, that the lowers, because they have metal rails front and back, aren't really that strong until the countertop gets on, until they're bolted to other cupboards. It's sort of like interlocks all together on their own. They're not as strong as I would have liked, but they seem fine now that they're all installed. So one thing you want to think about is, do your floors run all the way to the back of your cupboards? Mine did not. So I had to add plywood to make the floor level even. And then what I did was I went to Home Depot and bought this kickboard, and I cut a small section and I decided where I wanted it placed for each run. And then I marked it on the floor with a pencil, and then behind that I added a 2x4 that I screwed in between the legs of this cupboard, and that gave me a place to put glue and to glue these kickboards into place. And what happens is, if you don't have your measurements right, or if your floor slopes, you end up having to trim them on a table saw, which I also had to do. So that's quite a bit of work. My big tip and takeaway from this would be, make sure that you put a bead of caulking here so that water doesn't get into the melamine and make it bubble. But if your flooring doesn't go all the way underneath, you may be in for a bit of a hard time. I was assured by the guy at the design studio that all cupboards were the same. Take my word for it, they're not. Let's talk about my Ikea pantry. This is actually two separate cupboards screwed together. And so the way Ikea tells you to build it is you have your feet across the front and your feet across the sides, and they want you to cut your kickboard and clip them onto here, clip them here, 45 it, click it here and here. So if you don't want to be seen underneath your pantry by 3 inches all the way around, you need to buy these sides to go all the way to the floor. The problem is the ones for these cupboards would have ended right here, because this is an 80 centimeter pantry. So I bought the 90s and cut them to fit so that you wouldn't see underneath the sides and I wouldn't have that look. Want to talk about handles? These are not Ikea handles. These are 160 millimeter handles. Ikea sells 128 millimeter handles. You're better to stick with the 128 millimeter handles. I could not find a handle jig on Amazon at the hardware store that went to 160 millimeter. They all stop at 128. So you're causing yourself a lot of extra aggravation by putting on 160 millimeter handles. To fit this handle, I had to drill one by eye and then take a drawer jig and adjust it to fit. It's possible, it can be done, but why bother? So remember, anything bigger than 128 is hard to get a jig for. If you've been looking at my countertop, this is not an Ikea countertop. My friend who's a contractor, Johnny, suggested that I go to a kitchen place that's local, and they did a nice job, and I thank them very much. Now, Ikea countertops, to have an edge built like this would be extra. To have your sink undermounted would be extra. That was an easy thing to shop around for. The only thing I will tell you is when you're putting your cupboards in, make sure they're level. Take your extra time, make sure they're level front to back, sideways, all the way along, or your countertop guy is going to hate you. So just for full disclosure, this is not an Ikea countertop.